Welcome to Monday Night Live, the new weekly YouTube show from the staff at Inside ND Sports and the Rivals Network. I'm Eric Hansen. He's Tyler James. We're live in our little Brady Bunch boxes. Our recruiting writer, Kyle Kelly, is typing away somewhere on his laptop. The format of our show is likely going to evolve over the season, but the main thrust will be reviewing and breaking down the previous Notre Dame football game and spinning forward into what it means into the bigger picture of the season. We'll also take your questions toward the end of the show. But first, Marcus Freeman held his weekly Monday press conference at Notre Dame Stadium today. We had lots of interesting headlines, and we're going to take a look at those with Tyler James.
Yeah, and you are not limited to one question and a follow-up in the comment section. So please go ahead and submit questions, as many as you like, as soon as you like. But yeah, we will get to those at the end. My first headline, Eric, I think pretty obvious one. Tyler Buchner is out for the season. His shoulder injury is a high-grade AC sprain, which was to his non-throwing arm, and that will require surgery Tuesday and sideline him roughly 4 months. So we've seen the last of Tyler Buchner. Just 2 games into the season, certainly a big blow for Notre Dame's offense, and Notre Dame's going to have to figure out what it can become without him as the starting quarterback.
Well, I think this is an interesting story on a couple levels, both from the 2022 standpoint and the 2023 standpoint, in that he's still going to be a relatively inexperienced quarterback next year, even if he's QB1. Let's look at the 2022 implications. And you asked this question of Marcus Freeman today, but I want your answer to it because I heard his. What does this do in terms of changing the structure of the offense using different pages of the playbook?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to change in some ways. Obviously, Notre Dame's not going to run the ball in the same kind of ways with Drew Pyne as the quarterback. I do think there is some validity to what Marcus Freeman said about you can still do zone reads with Drew Pyne. He's not immobile in the way that Jack Cohn was immobile for Notre Dame's offense last season, but he's not going to be running away from a lot of guys either. But a lot of times the zone read is if you just clearly they didn't keep a guy there to account for you, and you can sort of take advantage of that. And then you also make sure that if you don't, they have to keep a guy there to account for you. So I think it will be different. He's not the same kind of athlete as Tyler Buchner. I don't necessarily agree with what Marcus Freeman said in terms of Drew Pyne having a strong arm. That was a bit surprising. So I don't know if he's going to be any better at the deep balls than Tyler Buchner was, which he seemed to not necessarily be on the same page with his receivers and be able to connect, especially against Marshall. And even some of the deep balls that he completed against Ohio State, the receivers had to make pretty tough catches to be able to make those plays where it wasn't necessarily something that he was making easy for them. So I'm fascinated to see what that looks like with Drew Pyne back there. But I think the offense has to look a bit different. But I mean, it makes sense. Even if it is going to look extremely different, there's no necessarily reason that Marcus Freeman has to tell us that, because I don't know that he wants to clue in Cal too much about what they're going to do offensively this weekend.
Well, here's one thing. Let's say Drew Pyne can express those plays maybe better than we're anticipating. But the guy's 5'11 and a half, 198. What are the chances that he's going to be durable enough to carry the ball as much as Tyler Buchner has? And Tyler was the leading rusher, the leader in rushing attempts, leader in rushing touchdowns. So how much do you really want to expose him to possible injury as a running quarterback?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be careful with him, but I mean, it was sort of my thoughts with Tyler Buchner was that, like, you can't protect him too much because you need him to run to be able to do what you want to do. Now, I don't know that they needed him. They wanted to be able to run him as much as they had to, especially against a Marshall team. You think that wouldn't be a game that you would need him to run as many times as he did. But yeah, I do think you have to protect Drew Pyne. I think he's a gutsy kid. I don't know how well he's going to protect himself. That will be something that we'll probably learn about Drew Pyne in the coming weeks. Tyler Buchner, I don't know that he necessarily protected himself as well as he could have, but it's a tough thing to do when you're asking him to gain as many yards as a runner as Notre Dame was asking him. So I think Notre Dame has to be somewhat careful. I mean, there's not a lot of depth in the quarterback
Right.
room. Steve Angeli is now the backup as a freshman, and behind him is Ron Paulus, the third. So after that, we were talking about walk-ons. So there's not a lot of guys there. So they have to be careful, but they also have to win games, and they're in a situation where whatever Notre Dame needs to do to win games is what they're probably going to be asking the quarterback to do.
We saw Steve Angeli in the spring game. For people that didn't want to subscribe to Peacock or weren't there in person, what do we know about Steve Angeli, both from that game and from maybe what you saw of his high school film and so forth, and what we saw in some of the practices?
Yeah, I mean there's certainly some intrigue with Steve Angeli. I mean, he's the most prototypical looking quarterback on Notre Dame's roster. And I think he has a pretty good arm, pretty good awareness. I think it was nice to see what he did in the blue gold game in terms of handling the moment. The competition he was playing against certainly wasn't that great. I mean, he was playing against backups and deep backups and walk-ons at that point in the scrimmage. So I don't take a lot out of him being able to make something happen in there, but I think it's good to see that he was willing to sort of handle that moment and was understanding what was being asked of him and being able to go out there and accomplish those things. So I understand there's some why people think he could be good, and I'm certainly curious to see. Rivals wasn't that big of a fan of him coming out of high school. He's a 3-star recruit as a pro style quarterback, and we will see. I mean, at some point, I don't know if it's going to be this season, but I would guess at some point this season, though, we would probably see some of them. I think you just have to get him some experience just because of the situation that Notre Dame's in right now.
Before I ask you the next quarterback question, I'll have to note this for you. I have 2 adult children, and one of them is calling me during this show. So obviously he's not watching. So we need to get him on board with watching the show so he knows when not to call, if nothing else. So we can maybe go into this deeper a little bit later, but the 2023 implications for all this is kind of interesting to me. And I wrote about it Sunday, anticipating that Buckner would be out for a long stretch of time. And that is, what does this do to 2023? Game reps are so important to his development for a guy that missed 2 high school seasons, through 35 passes as a freshman and had 111 plays total. Then you have Drew Pine, who presumably will be experienced. There's no 2023 quarterback yet signed to be a freshman to add to the class. And then you have CJ Carr sitting out there as a possible reclassification. So I gave you a good math problem. What is the best case scenario, do you think, going into 2023 with all that kind of on the table?
I don't know. It's hard to really say because, I mean, I guess the best case scenario is Drew Pine's a star, right? What if you want someone that can lead you to a national championship next season, because no one's going to be able to do that this season, right? So I mean, I guess it could be
that is safe to say.
whether that is Drew Pine, maybe it's Steve Angeli. I don't know that either of us can say that with a lot of confidence at this point, but you need to have someone play really well this season, and Tyler Buckner is going to have to earn his starting spot back. I think you're going to go into next season knowing not that much more about Tyler Buckner going into next season than you did going into this season, right? I mean, you had 2 games of action, which there were some good, some bad, some okay. I think you probably have a good understanding of how he handles the moment based off of what he did in the Ohio State game. But I think some of the questions that, at least from my perspective, that we had about Tyler Buckner, I don't know that they were answered with any sort of emphasis in these first 2 games. So I think you have a lot of questions there. I mean, I've been shouting anytime people ask about 2023 quarterback recruiting that you have to sign a 2023 quarterback. Everyone's like, well, we got Tyler Buckner. We got CJ Carr in 24. It'll be fine. We can get a grad transfer or whatever. Sign a quarterback every class. You never know what's going to happen. You're going to probably lose guys to transfer even when they do sign, but you'd rather you get them here and then they leave and then try to replace them than to just have the hole to begin with. So what that looks like, whether that's CJ Carr reclassifying, whether Notre Dame can get a 2023 quarterback that is already in the 2023 class. There's no obvious answer there yet. Notre Dame has work to do. Certainly, maybe it's more attractive for recruits saying, "Hey, Tyler Buck, you're gonna be in a competition with Tyler Buckner, but he didn't go out and blow the world up this past season because he got hurt," which isn't necessarily Tyler Buckner's fault, but it makes it a pretty honest discussion with these guys coming in. Like, hey, there's no one here, at least at this point. Maybe Drew, like if Drew Pine goes out and plays like an All-American, then we have a different discussion. But there, I think there's certainly lots of work to do. I mean, we've been saying for a while now that this is a big year for Tommy Rees and showing what he's been able to do in terms of developing Tyler Buckner and what he can do as a recruiter with the 2023 quarterback class. And things certainly have not gone in Tommy Rees's favor, with obviously some bad luck with Tyler Buckner. And you maybe even say some bad luck with quarterback recruiting, but there needs to be an answer there with quarterback recruiting that's better than, oh, that was just bad luck.
Before we move on to the next headline, I will add that Kyle Kelly, our recruiting writer, went up to Saline, Michigan on Friday and spoke with CJ. And one of the things they did talk about was the possible reclassification. Without giving too much away, his attitude has shifted from being pretty adamant against it to at least being open to revisiting it after his high school season ends. So it is a possibility where initially it looked like that wasn't something that he was interested in. Okay, headline number 2. That's going to be hard to beat number 1.
Yeah, and we're going to have to pick up the pace if we're going to get through all 5 headlines too. But this one's pretty related to number 1. And the second headline I had was Marcus Freeman has confidence in Drew Pine. Is it warranted? We will find out, right? I think given how the confidence in this team, what it looked like going into the season and what it has produced, it's hard to trust a lot of the confidence coming out of the Goog or out of the Notre Dame football program right now. So Marcus Freeman, as we've mentioned, didn't seem to think the offense would look that different from a play calling perspective outside of fewer runs designed for Drew Pine. The concern from my perspective is that most of the confidence in Drew Pine seems to be related to his leadership, his hard work, and a lot of intangibles, and has less to do with what he's physically capable of doing. Pete Byrne of WSBT asked Marcus Freeman today, what does he do best? What is the best thing he does physically on the field that you could point to? And Marcus, I counted, it was like close to 6 seconds. He said, I don't know. And then he got into his answer. And then his first part of his answer was he has the strength of his arm. That's not direct quote, but and then he got into sort of his ability to make decisions well. And so to me, that's not like, wow, that's really impressive. I'm really looking forward to what Drew Pine can do for this offense, because it wasn't a very inspiring answer from my perspective. Now maybe that's Marcus Freeman talking as a defensive coordinator and maybe not feeling confident in giving all kinds of praise to a quarterback because he just doesn't necessarily speak in quarterback terminology all the time. Or maybe it's revealing in that the reason why Drew Pine hasn't been able to win the starting quarterback job at Notre Dame is because he doesn't necessarily have those physical capabilities or abilities or talents that can complement what he brings as a leader, as a guy that guys rally around. And so I'm very curious to see what that looks like for Notre Dame. I can sort of buy into the ideas like, okay, everything is going poorly. We need someone to rally around. And I think Drew Pine is that kind of guy, but you have to have the play to match that as well. It can't be you can't just be a rah-rah guy and not go out and throw touchdown passes. That Notre Dame's offense needs him to do more than just that.
I think what's interesting here too is back, I think in late June, we had an opportunity where all the media outlets that cover Notre Dame got Marcus back to back to back. And during my little half hour, one of the things I asked him was, did you look at the transfer portal for a quarterback? And he said he talked to Tommy Rees about it, and Tommy was convinced that A, Buckner was better than anybody that was available to them in the portal, and B, that Drew Pine could play championship level football. And that was what, that was Tommy's assertion, and that Marcus bought into that. I'd say we don't know whether Buckner is better, but that's still out there. I mean, it wasn't proven that he isn't better.
Right.
But as far as a backup, it's going to be interesting because there were some really good quarterbacks that did match the admissions and the availability and the interest, but none of them had an interest in being the number 2 quarterback. So they would have wanted to be able to compete for number 1. And so I think that's why when people ask that question, that's why that went by the boards. Headline number 3.
Number 3, Marcus Freeman isn't a stranger to rebounding from tough times as a coach. Last year, the defense certainly didn't start the season very sharp. His first season as Cincinnati's defensive coordinator wasn't great, and things ended up going south for Purdue while he was there. So the hope for Notre Dame is that he's learned from those moments, and he has learned what he has learned from that is something that he can instill in this team. I'm curious, Eric, from your perspective, I know that was something you specifically asked about. What is your confidence in Marcus Freeman's ability to have learned from those things and be able to apply to Notre Dame in this situation?
Well, I think what I'm confident in is he's resilient enough to handle this, that he can handle the noise, that he can handle the negativity, that he understands team chemistry. What he needs to kind of prove to me in this situation is that he'll eventually come up with the answers on both sides of the ball. I think he can on the defensive side. Their numbers, I have them in my story, the column that I just wrote. They were down in the 90s and 100s, 80s, and all the national defensive categories after 2 games against Florida State and Toledo, and they ended up being the number 15 scoring defense in the country, and pretty good in the other defensive categories too. And at Cincinnati, they went from 94th to 11th in total defense in 1 year. So he knows how to do those things. The question is, again, whether he can affect those on offense, because he's really putting that in Tommy Rees's hands, at least the nuances of it. And so that's where it gets curious. Can that be fixed? And there are a lot of people relitigating this hiring right now. Oh, Jack Swarbrick should have never done it and so forth. But yeah, that's where I have confidence in Marcus, that from a character standpoint, they won. In the 4 years he was at Purdue, they were 3-30 in the Big Ten, and he learned some hard lessons and turned that into a lot of success at Cincinnati. Okay, headline number 4.
Inexperience and execution are the words of the week. Marcus Freeman said both of those things were to blame for the offensive struggles, and he also indicated that the inexperience has led to a lack of execution from his point of view. That could lead to Notre Dame simplifying some things to better utilize its talent. But Marcus Freeman owned up and said, hey, that's not an excuse. And this is a direct quote. Nobody cares that you're inexperienced. Nobody cares if we have guys that haven't played a whole bunch of football. The expectation is to go out there and do your job and execute and win.
He got a little word salady a couple times, but I think some of it is he's trying not to throw people under the bus, whether it's assistant coaches or players. And I think a word salad beats, making one of your players or assistant coaches look bad. We can kind of figure it out. So that was my take on that. And headline number 5.
Number 5, Notre Dame practices on Sundays because Marcus Freeman's used to that. I asked for the thought process behind that. It was something that I wasn't very familiar with, but I didn't get much of an answer outside of that Notre Dame will be doing it because that's what Marcus Freeman likes to do. I mean, that means Notre Dame will be practicing on Sundays and taking Mondays off this season. That didn't happen against Ohio or after the Ohio State game because of their travel delays. But when he was describing it that way, I wasn't thinking that practice was canceled on Sunday or Monday. I thought it just meant that they canceled it on Monday because of that. So I don't really know what the story is there. I was genuinely asking what is the value? Why do you want to do this? And I didn't really get that answer. I don't know if maybe he was a little defensive about being asked about it, that he just wanted people to feel like it was normal and not a reaction to the loss. But I can say, like, I guess I don't know for sure what other college football programs do. It didn't seem to me on the face that it was something that was normal. I hadn't necessarily heard much about it, but I also don't necessarily look into the other teams' practice schedules either. And haven't covered another college football program besides Notre Dame. So that was a bit surprising to me. Maybe somewhere down the road we can get a better answer to the thought process behind why it's good to practice on Sunday and then take Monday off.
And just a review, that the one question and a follow, it really is two questions, but the format doesn't lend itself to getting to the bottom of questions like that.
Right.
Because normally you just, I kind of cheated today because I asked him how the reps were going to be split between Angeli and Pine. And he said, well, Angeli's with the twos and Pine's with the ones, which wasn't what I was looking for. I was looking for the percentage.
Yeah.
And so I had to kind of sneak that one in. So I had 2.5 today.
Yeah. I probably should have tried to follow up to get more of a why, but sometimes you feel bad when you're like restating the questions too. But I mean, and it wasn't that big of a deal. Like, it wasn't like I need to know right now why you're practicing on Sunday instead of Monday. But I wasn't necessarily satisfied with the answer that I was given, which is fine. He doesn't have to answer the questions that we asked them either. But I think we would like to get some sort of insight to that, and maybe we will down the road.
Okay, well, we're going to put the headlines aside now and take a look at the bottom line from Saturday's Notre Dame Marshall game. The final score was 26-21, dropping Notre Dame to 0-2 and dropping Marcus Freeman to 0-3 as head coach, the first Notre Dame head coach that can claim to be 0-3. Some key stats in the game. The one that jumps out at me is the fourth quarter drive. Marshall went 94 yards in 11 plays. 64 of those came on the ground. And it was very reminiscent of the Ohio State fourth quarter drive, where they went 95 yards in 14 plays. And both of those drives to me were baffling. And let's start there before we jump into the other stats, Tyler. So as you look at those two drives, is there a common thread besides them not doing the job? Is there something a fix that you can see, or a flaw that you can see that allowed those things to happen 2 weeks in a row?
Yeah, I mean, certainly missed tackles had a lot to do. I think more with the Marshall drive than the Ohio State drive. I don't remember it being as much of a missed tackle. Now, maybe they were running through more Ohio State was running through more tackles. It felt more to me like Ohio State was punching Notre Dame in the mouth, where Marshall they were certainly being physical, but they were also outsmarting and just sort of out executing Notre Dame, especially with the third down play, particularly that one. That was one of my defining plays in my 6 defining plays after the game. Was third down, you got them backed up. I think it was 3rd and 8, and Marshall doesn't even run that complicated of a play. It's just an RPO, a quick dump off to the tight end. He has a tight end blocking for him, and he picks up the first down because Notre Dame didn't really cover him, and that really set up the rest of the drive, and then more breakdowns from there. So I don't know. I mean, I think it was last week on this show. Maybe I said it in a different place, but I said, well,
we can check the tape.
We'll check the tape. But I sort of said that, well, maybe I in the back of my mind, I wondered if all these things that Al Golden is asking Notre Dame's defense to do is going to get too complicated. And against Ohio State, that didn't necessarily seem to be the case. Now, is that why they're failing late in the games? I don't know. I mean, I can't really tell you if that's why or not. If the calls aren't necessarily being understood, if there's something going on there, I don't have insight to that at this moment. So it seems kind of strange. Like 1 week later, it's like, well, maybe things are too complicated. When I sort of felt last week, it's like, well, things must not be too complicated. They played well against Ohio State, but I mean, that's what football can do to you. When you think you have something figured out, that doesn't necessarily mean you do have it figured out. So Notre Dame, needs to figure that out. Like that's on them to figure that out rather than us. I had a prop bet before the show, Eric, how many times I could say figure that out. That's why I keep saying it. But
I was going to say, let's put it on a pot holder or collectible plate.
Well, I mean, do you have any thoughts of why that was going on?
I did wonder, and the question was asked later in the press conference. It would have been one, if I had unlimited questions, I would have asked it about the simplification, because last year, after the 2 games that they were so far down in the defensive statistics, they did simplify. That was the problem last year. And so again, kind of giving Al Golden his reign there and letting him implement it, the players not complaining about it, embracing it. And then in practice, or I mean, meaning in a game, that maybe it is too complicated. I think it's something that they have to look at. And I think Marcus Freeman is open to looking at it, because you look at some of their best athletes like Isaiah Foskey and Maris Leofau, and they look average in this defense in a couple of weeks. I mean, there's Howard Cross stood out on Saturday, but I don't know. I think it's certainly something that they need to get to the bottom of. Okay, well, some other stats from the game. Marshall outrushed Notre Dame 219 to 130. And the traditional running game of the running backs of Logan Diggs, Audric Estime, and Chris Tyree were 20 carries for 57 yards. So that's less than 3 yards a carry. The overall yards, 364 for Marshall to 351 Notre Dame. So it was pretty even there, but the turnover differential was 3-0. Notre Dame was 4 of 13 on third down. They're one of the worst third down offenses in the country. 2 of 4 on fourth down. They went for it a couple times around midfield. When they didn't get it, one was a run up the middle by Audric Estime that got stuffed, and one was a short pass that was incomplete from Tyler Buckner. They did convert a couple times. Tyler chided me for thinking that it was smart to give it to Chris Tyree on 4th and short, but I felt like I'm vindicated with that. So any of those things jump out at you that you want to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Marshall outrushed them was surprising to me. I know Marshall, I expected them to be good at running the football, but I thought Notre Dame would be able to stop them. But I also thought Notre Dame would have more success running the football. And certainly the usage of Chris Tyree has been asked of Marcus Freeman now, both after the game and again today. So I think that's a fair question. I've always wondered just how much of a well-rounded running back Chris Tyree is, and if he's maybe more of a gadget player than an every down back. But I think you got to find ways to get him the football, because he's being just as successful as anyone else right now, if not more successful. And it is more successful right now, though he's not necessarily being asked to do the same things. Although when you give him the ball on 4th down and short, then you're asking him to do just as much as you would be asking Audric Estime to do, because you think that would be his strength versus Chris Tyree's. And then the turnovers as well. That's the other thing. Notre Dame's offense can't turn the football over the way it did. Tyler Buckner, I think, showed a little bit too much trust in his wide receivers in some situations. Drew Pine just didn't see a guy dropping back, and I think that has to be a concern moving forward for Drew Pine, given his height, whether or not he can see when that stuff happens from a guy dropping off the line of scrimmage and into coverage. And so I think it's not going to be a winning recipe for Notre Dame, even against a team like Marshall, when the other team has a +3 turnover margin in their favor.
Okay, and just another side note, the other son just tried to call me, so nobody in my family is watching this. So thank you, people from other families, for tuning in tonight. We're going to move into our In the Trenches segment, because we love offensive line play. And so we're going to take a look at offensive line play in the Marshall game. So when we look at Pro Football Focus's ratings, they go through and they grade film for every FBS team Notre Dame's overall offensive line rankings, both from run blocking and pass blocking, took a big jump. Jarrett Patterson played okay. I mean, not up to his standard, but it was a huge difference between what Andrew Kristofic did against a better Ohio State front than Jarrett Patterson's grade was a lot higher. The thing was, the people around Jarrett Patterson, particularly Joe Alt, played way better in the second game. Joe Alt actually was the highest rated offensive player for Notre Dame in the game. But overall, to your eye test, given Marshall's talent level, how would you have graded the offensive line play? Did you feel like there was improvement?
Well, I certainly haven't gone through and graded every play in the same way that PFF purports to do, but I did not see a massive jump in level of play from Notre Dame's offensive line. I didn't think it was that much better than last week. I think it was in certain areas, but I expected it to be more. But I mean, on second thought, I mean, if communication is such a big issue, it's probably going to take more than 1 week to fix that. So I think what we've seen from Ohio State and Marshall in terms of the stunts, the twists, the slants, whether it's against the run or against the pass, defenses are going to continue to do that to try to confuse Notre Dame's offensive line because they're not necessarily all on the same page. And that's been proven these last 2 weeks. Even when it comes to disrupting zone run blocking by definition should be able to handle any sort of movement that gets thrown at it because you're not assigned a man. You're going to an area, and whoever comes into that area is who you're going to block. Now, it's not always that simple. There's more layers to that, but that's sort of the base level of zone blocking. And that's not necessarily being what's playing out for Notre Dame right now. Notre Dame is kind of going to a place and like, what who am I supposed to block? What am I supposed to do? And I guess from my perspective, when you're looking at offensive line play, it's one thing to make a mistake, but if you're going to make a mistake, just go ahead and hit somebody. Don't turn around. Don't look around. Find something to do. Don't make the problem worse by not going after someone else, even if it's the wrong guy, because that's going to be much better than just like saying, oh man, there's no one here for me to do anything. Go find some work, get something done, get something accomplished to make up for the mistake that you may have already made. So I just think the entire line has struggled to get consistent push. I thought Jarrett Patterson and Joe Alt were the best run blockers, and Pro Football Focus did agree with me on that. The tight ends are not helping from my perspective. Going 12 and 13 personnel is detrimental if Kevin Bauman and Michael Mayer aren't holding up their ends of the deal. Yeah. I've been surprised by the lack of Davis Sherwood as a fullback, considering the lack of success without him. I didn't think he'd be in every first down, but I thought he would certainly see some more short yardage situations than he has. So I didn't think the pass blocking was necessarily great from either of Notre Dame's offensive tackles. Those young guys who have all kinds of potential still have work to do there. So I was not. You started the segment by saying we love offensive line play. I didn't love the offensive line play that I was seeing from Notre Dame on Saturday because I thought there was still a lot to be desired.
Well, we love good offensive line play or great offensive line play. Here's one thing I'll mention, then I want to ask you a question. The Harry Hiestand lines haven't always come out of the gate super hot. The 2017 team, it was about game 5 where they really found their stride. Not that they were maybe this regressive early in the season, but around week 5, they became dominant, and they were dominant pretty much the rest of that year, with the exception of the Miami game where they were all in the toilet. The whole team was. If you remember, I think it was 41-7 down in Miami, still kind of an inexplicable loss in the Brian Kelly era. There's a few of those that just are head scratchers. But what I wanted to ask you, and it came up in the press conference today, and it was on my mind, is do you think an eventual move of Jarrett Patterson back to center makes sense to consider?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense to consider. I'm not sure what that does. I mean, I'm not sure what it does in terms of helping your communication, because you're just going to be adding more variables that aren't necessarily haven't been playing together. Now, I don't know. I don't think Zeke Correll has played that well. I did think Jarrett Patterson played decent against Marshall, and considering he's coming back from a foot, I still don't think he's probably 100%.
Right, and he may be playing in extreme pain. I mean, the whole thought of that was he can start playing, but it's going to be his pain tolerance that determines his playing time.
Now, certainly, I'm sure he's killing himself over the false start penalty that he had that turned a 3rd and 3 into a 3rd and 8 and really messed things up for Notre Dame late in the game and their ability to keep the drive going. But like I said, I mean, I'd be willing to entertain it. I mean, I think you'd have to, if you're going to do it, you'd look at it doing it during the bye week.
Yep, absolutely.
But it maybe that is it too late if you wait that long? I don't really know. I mean, I
don't think so. I mean, they've done things like that during the bye weeks before, and you know the question is,
I guess I'm more meant of like, are you? I'm more meant if you wait that long, are you going to lose the next 2 games because you waited that long to make that choice? That was what I was meaning. Now, yeah. I don't think that's the case. I think it could still work in this current setup. And Marcus Freeman certainly didn't give any indication that they're entertaining playing another 5 guys on the offense, playing anyone besides the 5 guys that they've been playing on the offensive line. So I guess I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. It wouldn't shock me if that move happened, and anything that can make this unit better, I would be in support of, certainly. But I'm not sure if the answer is that simple.
Speaking of simple answers, we go to our questions answered segment, meaning what did we learn from the game that we know are absolutes? What are the questions that were answered in the game? And I don't think the list is going to be really long.
No, my first question was, were we all duped? And I think the answer is yes. This team just is not ready to win on a weekly basis. That has been proven. The confidence coming from the program was totally overblown. And I'm starting to wonder if maybe Notre Dame wasn't just hiding itself from Ohio State when it limited our access to competitive practice reps, but it was also hiding its deficiencies from us as the media as well. Now, maybe I'm being selfish and saying, well, the only reason I thought this team would be good because I didn't see them be bad enough in the preseason. I mean, I can handle being wrong. It doesn't impact me that much. But I'd like to be right. I mean, that's my preference certainly. But there's no way that we can know. I mean, if we can,
I'm sure Marcus Freeman is fretting over whether you were right or wrong.
No,
come on, guys, let's win for Tyler. We want him to be right.
No, they don't care, but our readers, our listeners, our viewers, they care whether we're right. Otherwise, what's the point of listening to us? I think. I mean, that was the first question that was answered. Were we all duped? What do you think? Do you think we were duped this preseason?
I don't know that they knew. I think Tommy Rees thought the offensive line would play better. That's my thought there. And I also think that they were pretty confident in their defense. And I think they were as surprised as we were that they got pushed around in the fourth quarter 2 weeks in a row. I think they thought there would be some growing pains and stuff. The thing is, it hasn't happened at the places that we maybe thought, like cornerbacks getting picked on and so forth. Maybe that'll be this week's surprise, but I need another week before I get huffy about not seeing enough practice.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I probably shouldn't say I'm huffy, but I think I tweeted at one point. I was like, I didn't see a single rep of fully padded offensive and defensive line reps going against each other. And that probably would have been a little bit enlightening, but maybe
we did not see many competitive periods.
Right. That was the problem. That was my issue with that. But beyond that, getting to something that you said, Tommy Rees thought the offensive line would be better. That's also was my takeaway from the start of last season. So why is that happening? What why is there a disconnect there that Tommy Rees isn't getting a read of the offensive line with two different coaches now,
Right.
and being able to configure an offense that can work around its maybe deficiencies on the offensive line. And it certainly isn't at the start because they don't seem to be understanding or believing that there's going to be issues on the offensive line.
Okay. So our next segment is called Questions Lingering, and that would be a 2-hour segment. So let's limit it to one question lingering, the most important question that's lingering in your mind coming out of the Marshall game.
Oh man, if I had to pick one, I mean, the most important I think is what can Tommy Rees make of this offense? That's the most important one, because and I don't know that we have a good answer to that, and that's why it's still lingering.
Well, I think that had Tyler Buckner still been a part of this team, we were kind of starting to see the lean toward Buckner having to be involved. That was part of in the run game. That was part of the answer, and I don't think that's the same answer with Drew Pine. It's got to be a different answer. So I'm really curious to see what they come up with against a Cal team that's not a world beater at 2-0. They beat Cal Davis and UNLV, but Justin Wilcox is a pretty good defensive mind. That's their head coach. And so, it's not going to be an easy day for Tommy Rees. Speaking of easy days, it's easy to take your questions now for us. And we're going to start.
What a segue pro from Eric Hansen.
What a segue. And and that was without any beer. So
all right, well, I'll take over from here and start throwing the questions at us that
okay.
Our viewers have sent us, and you continue to do that. We will spend most of the next 15 minutes or so answering questions from y'all, and that y'all was a shout out to Carter Carls. First question we have is from Ed Coquillard. I haven't heard much about Ron Paulus III. What do we know about him if he becomes number 2 down the line if injuries occur?
Well, number one, injuries have occurred to him last year. We didn't see him at all last year. We saw him a little bit in practice. He's, he can throw a nice ball. He's a big kid. I don't think he'll ever start a game at Notre Dame unless there are a lot more injuries than we anticipate. I think he's a guy that will be running the scout team for the rest of the season. And that's about it. That's the best I can do with Ron Paulus. I mean, did you see him play in high school?
Yeah, I saw him multiple times, and both as a reporter working for the South Bend Tribune and also just as a fan because my dad is a high school coach at LaPorte High School, and they were playing against Penn on a yearly basis. So I saw them at least once or twice, I think twice play against LaPorte. Although I think maybe, I don't know exactly how many times I saw him play, but I saw him play multiple times. I did not think he would be a Notre Dame scholarship quarterback, to be frank. I thought he had a decent arm. He didn't have great receivers at Penn, and the receivers he did have were pretty small.
Well, that might be the situation now.
Right? We'll that's not a good harbinger of things to come if he's asked to play for Notre Dame this season. But no, certainly the Notre Dame receivers are better than the receivers he played with at Penn High School. But I was surprised when Notre Dame added him sort of at the very end of its recruiting cycle as a scholarship player. And I even reached out to Notre Dame saying, hey, is he a scholarship player? And they assured me that he was. And I was a bit surprised by that. Now, so, I mean, you sort of feel bad, like criticizing a kid in that way. But when they put him on scholarship, it's like, well, I have to treat him just like any other scholarship player that Notre Dame would recruit. And we give our opinions all the time on guys that Notre Dame gives a scholarship to, whether or not we think this guy is going to be able to play early. So he would need to do a lot of development in order to be an impact player at Notre Dame, or someone that Notre Dame could count on to start a game, in my opinion. He's not a very mobile quarterback. He's a big kid. I heard people not from Notre Dame's side, but people wondering, man, if maybe he should be like a defensive end or something, because he had a good build. I don't think he was going to be like a defensive end at Notre Dame, but maybe that would be a better use of his athleticism. But I don't know that he's in a position to be of great help to Notre Dame's offense if he's asked to play right now.
Okay.
Next, go ahead.
Okay.
All right. Next question is from Tanner5405. Feel for Buckner, hopeful for a speedy recovery. Could they use Drew Pine as the throwing QB and Angeli as the running QB in packages a la Golston/Reese back in the day?
I don't know that Angeli is necessarily a markedly better runner than Drew Pine is. He's certainly bigger, maybe on goal line or something, maybe in the red zone, but I think that they would like to keep Pine as the primary quarterback and not do the package deal like the tag team like Brian Kelly did last year, or the one you referenced with Golson and Reese in 2012.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I guess Angeli would be able to handle being the runner just because he's bigger, I think, is maybe the thought there. But yeah, I don't see Angeli getting out there to stretch the defense or get them more concerned about that. I would be surprised if that were something that Notre Dame opted to use. Next question, and this is a great question for Eric. I guess because Eric loves, especially in his chat, when people compliment him. I always give him a hard time that he only chooses the questions that people compliment him. Eric from Smoking Scott.
All of them are compliments.
From Smoking Scott, Eric, glad to hear the golden voice of ND. How much of last week do we put on Tommy? Marshall brought up both safeties and left the middle wide open. I thought we could see a lot more RPOs.
Tyler and I don't know that we had a debate about this, but we had a discussion about it. And I didn't think the play calling, at least in the first half, was stellar. I mean, I don't think it was the kind of play calling that would get Kirk Herbstreit excited and call. I guess my expectations for Tommy Reese this year were pretty high as a play caller. And I thought there were things that Marshall was doing offensively that were smarter than what Notre Dame was doing offensively. Now, there was a lack of execution on some of the plays. Tyler Buckner missed some wide open receivers. I thought some of the running backs, other than Chris Tyree, were kind of tiptoeing up to the line sometimes, being a little tentative instead of just pounding through the line like Layburn was for Marshall. And I thought Tommy made some adjustments in the second half where he was throwing to Michael Mayer more and running Tyler Buckner more. But I think there was a lot of blame to go around, and I think Tommy Reese had his share in it.
Yeah, we definitely did discuss that. I think the part that maybe I should be more critical of Tommy Reese being that he's built an offense that needs.
He's also the quarterback's coach too, so he's in charge of developing the quarterback.
True. Yeah. That is fair. I guess I don't necessarily equate that when people ask us about his play calling specifically.
Right.
But so what I was getting at was maybe I should be more critical of Tommy Reese for seemingly building an offense that needs to hit on these deep shots that it doesn't seem like they are capable of coming through on. Now, they are really close in some situations, like, and there have been opportunities, whether it's the receiver doing the wrong thing, whether it's Tyler Buckner throwing it too far, not throwing it far enough. There just have been too many issues there. And so my thought is like, well, if they just execute what they're asking them, like that's a great play call. If they could just complete the pass. But maybe he shouldn't be asking them to do that because that's not what they're good at. That would go back to sort of what I was talking about earlier. Is like he hasn't seemed to anticipate the deficiencies on the offensive line. Maybe he's not anticipating the deficiencies with the deep ball. But also, I mean, we don't know. Like he could be completing those in practice all the time, and then it comes to game day and it's not happening. And so through 2 games, you only get so many opportunities to try to come through in those situations. So that was one thing. The other thing was like the usage of Chris Tyree. I don't know how much of that is related to Tommy Reese or how much is that related to Dylan McCullough. How much is he dictating who was putting the running backs into the game at a certain time? I know Marcus Freeman talked about, hey, we're playing Chris Tyree a lot, but it's not always in the running back role. We're asking him to do different
31
things.
plays he had in
So
Saturday's game.
so that was what. So I don't know. Like, does Tommy Reese have to sell Thielen McCullough? No, I need him at running back so we can do this. Well, I don't know how that communication works. That'd be something I'd be interested to getting maybe more insight into. I don't think we'll get the assistant coach during the season because we haven't necessarily in years past, but maybe that will change. But
you'll have to use one of your 2 questions next week on that.
Yeah, I guess that's the case. But yeah, I mean, there is fair criticism of Tommy Reese. I think some of it isn't always fair. I think anytime you lose and you're the play caller, you're going to look bad. Like it's just hard to go about that. But not the result isn't always based on a bad play call either. So I think sometimes there needs to be a little bit more parsing of what happened and why it happened the way it did. Next question we have is another one from Tanner4505. Has the ND team got out over their skis with the amount of media/social media attention and other possible distractions like the Shamrock Series mini movie and with NIL deals for certain players?
I like that, out over their skis. My dad was a ski jumper when he was a teenager and broke both kneecaps.
Wow.
How's that for a side?
That's quite the story.
Yeah. I actually saw the ski jump. We went to Norway, where he's from, and saw the ski jump. And he goes, "What do you think about that?" And he was waiting for a compliment. I said, "I think you're crazy, Dad." So anyways, back to over the skis. I got over the skis on my sidebar there. I don't think so. I mean, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that be a distraction. And like even with Tyler Buckner, I mean, he had somebody that was handling his NIL stuff this summer, and he was just very disinterested in it. So no, I don't think it's been that. I think that's easy to point to when teams are losing, but I also think those things, like the little video about going to Las Vegas, which was when nobody was in school, nobody was practicing. They didn't take time away from anything to do that. It helps recruiting. And so I think there's some value in that. But I think it's a good question to ask. I just don't think that's the root of this problem.
Yeah, I think the only thing it took away from was I was trying to interview Isaiah Foskey and Michael Mayer. Like, well, they're actually not in town right now. So I ended up having to reschedule that. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that was a huge distraction. I mean, and it was when you're talking about the Shamrock Series video, the only two, I mean, I guess if you want to include Marcus Freeman in this question, but I think if we're talking about the players specifically, that just included Isaiah Foskey and Michael Mayer. Now, I know Isaiah Foskey hasn't necessarily played the way people thought he would play coming into the season, given how well he played last year. I think it's fair to criticize his play, but I'm not sure that I buy into how he spent his offseason in small windows as the reason why he's playing the way he is playing. Maybe there's something to that, but I would need more evidence to support that than sort of what we've seen or what we know. So the NIL deals, I don't think that. I think the guys have figured out a way to handle that and not make it too much of a problem. So I don't know. These guys are used to managing their time. They're asked to do so many things that they know how to figure those things out usually. So especially when you're talking about your best players, I don't think that is a major reason or major impact hasn't made an impact on the way Notre Dame has played to start the season. All right, let's go with one last question, Eric, from Rob Lobo 123. Will Tommy Reese get demoted before the end of the season? The offense is ranked 117th in scoring offense, and I have little faith that Tommy can make drastic improvements.
I would say the chances of that are zero. Marcus Freeman has faith in Tommy Reese. And if you're going to demote him, there's not, I mean, I guess you could promote Jared Parker. He's been an offensive coordinator. I don't think that there's really somebody ideal beyond him. Harry Heastan hasn't been an offensive coordinator, and Dylan McCullough would like to be one.
Harry Heastan would say no if you asked him to call the plays. I don't think he would accept that responsibility.
Yeah. So, and Chancey Stuckey's pretty new to coaching. Dylan McCullough would like to be an offensive coordinator, is learning to be one. but isn't one yet. And you got to give this a chance to play out. But I said at the beginning of the year, this is going to be a defining year for Tommy Rees, for better or for worse, and there may be better in store down the road. So let's let it play out. But no, I do not think he's going to get demoted. He may get scolded, and he may get a mean column from Tyler, but not demoted.
Yeah, and maybe something happens in the offseason. I'm not ready to go there yet after just 2 games. We have to see how the rest of the season goes. But certainly not midseason. That would be more shocking than Notre Dame's 0-2 start, in my opinion, if Tommy Rees were to get demoted midseason from offensive coordinator, given these circumstances. All right, Eric, that's all we have for questions for today. I wanted to quickly ask you to give us a little bit of a preview of what is ahead for Notre Dame on Saturday going up against Cal.
Well, Cal has started out 2-0. They beat UC Davis 34-13. UC Davis is an FCS school that has not won a game yet. They beat another future Notre Dame opponent 20-14 in a pretty close game this past Saturday. As I mentioned earlier, Justin Wilcox, who is a pretty well-known, well-respected defensive coordinator, is Cal's head coach. He's 28-28 at Cal. And if you look at their statistics nationally, they're not a team that, jumps off the page at you, but they're better defensively than they are offensively. Jack Plummer, who Notre Dame faced in September last season, they'll face him with Purdue. They'll face him with Cal. It was interesting because the Notre Dame-Purdue game was kind of the end of Jack Plummer being the number 1 undisputed quarterback at Purdue. Aiden O'Connell came in toward the end of that game and then eventually became the number 1 quarterback and is Purdue's prolific quarterback now. But Jack Plummer has he's about 65th in the country in pass efficiency. He's in the low 140s with his pass efficiency rating, which is about what Tyler Buckner put up as a freshman last year. So again, this is a team that I think Notre Dame can't take lightly, but I think it's a game that Notre Dame should win. They're favored, or they were favored at least yesterday before the quarterback announcement by about 12 points. But this will be a good test to see if Notre Dame learned some lessons and improved from last week against Marshall.
Yeah, just to either I didn't hear you correctly, or you may have forgotten. The future Notre Dame opponent that Cal played last week was
UNLV.
UNLV.
Right.
Just so in case people were curious who that was. So Cal had its own struggles against a team you wouldn't necessarily expect it to struggle against, but Notre Dame certainly is not in a position to downplay the quality of opponents after what happened last Saturday.
I think Marshall's going to end up being a decent team, but Notre Dame can't lose to a team like that. There's just no way. They have so much more talent. Even with 24 guys from the transfer portal, there's just no excuse for that. But I do think Marshall's going to end up with a winning record and do pretty well in a pretty competitive Sun Belt this year. The Sun Belt had a good Saturday. They beat Appy State from the Sun Belt, knocked off Carter's Texas A&M Aggies at home, and it was raining. No, never mind. And then Georgia Southern beat Nebraska on the road, and Georgia State took North Carolina to the fourth quarter and lost by a touchdown. So a good week for the Sun Belt.
All right, that's all we have for today. We appreciate everyone tuning in. If you are watching this on replay, leave us a comment about topics you maybe want us to tackle next week. We're always interested in maybe tweaking our format or different areas of discussions that we should try to feature more. If you're not already, subscribe to us so you can receive a reminder for next Monday's live show. We'll be back on YouTube on Friday with our Place Your Bets predictions for Saturday's game against Cal. We will record our latest Inside Indy Sports podcast on Tuesday. If you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, we have been having some issues there, so hopefully we get that straightened out this week. And, of course, we'll have plenty of written coverage coming your way on InsideNDSports.com.